Today marks 1 month since Russia began its carnage in Ukraine, the brutal invasion of Ukraine. And we held a NATO summit the very next day. At that time, my overwhelming objective in wanting that summit was to have absolute unity on 3 key important issues among our NATO and European allies. First was to support Ukraine with military and humanitarian assistance. Second was to impose the most significant sanctions, economic sanction regime ever, in order to cripple Putin's economy and punish him for his actions. Third was to fortify the eastern flank of our NATO allies, who were obviously very, very concerned and somewhat worried what would happen. We accomplished all 3 of these, and today we're determined to sustain those efforts and to build on them. The United States is committed to provide over $2 billion in military equipment to Ukraine since I became president: anti-air systems, anti-armor systems, ammunition, and our weapons are flowing into Ukraine as I speak. And today I'm announcing the United States is prepared to commit more than $1 billion in humanitarian assistance to help get relief to millions of Ukrainians affected by the war in Ukraine. Many Ukrainian refugees will wish to stay in Europe, closer to their homes. But we also will welcome 100,000 Ukrainians to the United States with a focus on reuniting families. And we will invest $320 million to bolster democratic resilience and defend human rights in Ukraine and neighboring. Putin was banking on NATO being split. My early conversation with him in December and early January was clear to me he didn't think we could sustain this cohesion. NATO has never been more united than it is today. Putin is getting exactly the opposite what he intended to have as a consequence of going into Ukraine. We've built that same unity with the European Union and with the leading democracies of the G7, in the G7. So,
can you talk to us about 2 things, sir? One, since your conversation with President Xi of China, have you seen any indications of action or lack of action from China that has led you to believe whether they will intervene and help Russia, either with the sale of arms or the provision of supplies to support this war in Ukraine? And secondly, can you say whether the conversation today turned to the subject of food shortages and what the U.S. will do to address wheat shortages in particular as a result of this war? Thank you.
On the first question relating to President Xi Jinping of China, I had a very straightforward conversation with Xi now, I guess it's 6 days ago, 7 days ago, in that range. And I made it clear to him, I made no threats, but I made it clear to him that make sure he understood the consequences of him helping Russia, as had been reported and as what it was expected. And I made no threats, but I pointed out the number of American and foreign corporations that left Russia as a consequence of their barbaric behavior. And I indicated that I knew how much he, because we had long discussions in the past about his interest in making sure he had economic relations and economic growth with Europe and the United States, and indicated that he'd be putting himself at significant jeopardy in those aims if, in fact, he were to move forward. I am not going to comment on any detail about what we know or don't know as a consequence of that conversation. But tomorrow or next Monday that Ursula's having that conference with China? The 1st, on April 1st. We've had discussions because I think that China understands that its economic future is much more closely tied to the West than it is to Russia. And so I'm hopeful that he does not get engaged. We also did discuss today that there's a need for us to set up, NATO to set up, and the EU to set up a system whereby we have an organization looking at who has violated any of the sanctions and where and when and how they violated them. And that's something we're going to put in train. It's not done yet.
And then also, do you think that Russia needs to be removed from the G20?
On the latter point, my answer is yes. That depends on the G20. That was raised today, and I raised the possibility if that can't be done, if Indonesia and others do not agree, then we should, in my view, ask to have both Ukraine be able to attend the meetings, as well as basically Ukraine being able to attend the G20 meeting and observe. No, that's not how I think of this. I've been dealing with foreign policy for longer than anybody that's involved in this process right now. I have no concerns about the impact. I made a commitment when I ran this time. I wasn't going to run again, and I mean that sincerely. I had no intention of running for president again. And until I saw those folks coming out of the fields in Virginia carrying torches and carrying Nazi banners and literally singing the same vile rhyme that they used in Germany in the early 20s, or 30s, I should say. And then when the gentleman you mentioned was asked what he thought, and a young woman was killed, a protester, and he was asked what he thought, he said, "There are very good people on both sides." And that's when I decided I wasn't going to be quiet any longer. And when I ran this time, and I think the American press, whether they look at me favorably or unfavorably, will acknowledge this, I made a determination. Nothing is worth, no election is worth my not doing exactly what I think is the right thing. Not a joke. I'm too long in the tooth to fool with this any longer. And so we're a long way off in elections, a long way off. My focus, if any election, is on making sure that we retain the House and the United States Senate so that I have the room to continue to do the things that I've been able to do in terms of grow the economy and deal in a rational way with American foreign policy and lead the world, be the leader of the free world. So, but it's not an illogical question for someone to ask. I say to people at home, imagine if we sat and watched the doors of the Bundestag broken down and police officers killed and hundreds of people storming in. Or imagine if we saw that happening in the British Parliament or whatever. How would we feel? And one of the things that I take some solace from is I don't think you'll find any European leader who thinks that I am not up to the job. And I mean that sincerely. It's not like, whoa, it's that. The point is that when the first G7 meeting I attended, like the one I did today, was in Great Britain. And I sat down and I said, America's back. And one of my counterparts, colleagues, as head of state, said, for how long? For how long? And so I don't blame, I don't criticize anybody for asking that question. But the next election, I'd be very fortunate if I had.
Deterrence didn't work. What makes you think Vladimir Putin will alter course based on the action you've taken today?
Let's get something straight. You remember, if you covered me from the very beginning, I did not say that, in fact, the sanctions would deter him. Sanctions never deter. You keep talking about that. Sanctions never deter. The maintenance of sanctions, the increasing the pain, and the demonstration why I asked for this NATO meeting today is to be sure that after a month we will sustain what we're doing, not just next month, the following month, but for the remainder of this entire year. That's what will stop him.
Do you believe the actions today will have an impact on making Russia change course in Ukraine?
That's not what I said. You're playing a game with me. I know. The answer is no. I think what happens is we have to demonstrate the purpose. The single most important thing is for us to stay unified. And the world continue to focus on what a brute this guy is. And all the innocent people's lives are being lost and ruined and what's going on. That's the important thing. But look, if you're Putin and you think that that Europe is going to crack in a month or 6 weeks or 2 months, why not? They can take anything for another month, but we have to demonstrate. The reason I asked for the meeting, we have to stay fully, totally, thoroughly united. Thank you.